Good evening. Welcome to the 4th Annual Wilderness Speaker Series. I'm Carol Treadwell, Executive Director of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. And the Speaker Series is hosted by the Foundation and the Montana Wilderness Association and by the college's Continuing Education Department. And thanks to them for opening the doors and setting up the chairs. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation takes folks into the wilderness for volunteer service projects every summer, all summer long. And in the wintertime, we bring this speaker series to you, to the front country. Tonight, we're pleased to have as our speaker one of the managers of the Bob Complex. The Wilderness Speaker Series covers topics of management of wilderness, science, scenery, wildlife, everything within the definition of the Wilderness Act. And so tonight, our topic is management. And Seth Carbonari is the Fire Management Officer at the Spotted Bear Ranger District, Flathead National Forest. He graduated from Flathead High School and the University of Montana. He served in the Navy and has worked for the DNRC, the National Park Service, the Forest Service, in fire-related assignments and jobs across the United States, from Alaska to the Everglades to California, and internationally in Ethiopia and Brazil. We're glad to have him back in the Flathead Valley. And in addition to his fire duties, he also assists with the Flathead Avalanche Center and enjoys a myriad of outdoor activities that this area provides. Tonight, Seth is going to discuss wilderness fire management and some of the challenges with the fires of 2015. Please help me welcome Seth Carbonari.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Does this sound weird yet? Okay, let me know if it doesn't come out right. It probably is going to come a little bit weird to me, but I'll bear with it if you guys bear with it. Thanks for coming. I appreciate everyone being here and appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I really love. The Bob Marshall Wilderness is a pretty special place and has a pretty special place in my heart. Pretty amazing area. Along with that, I'm also pretty fascinated by fire. As a natural process, it's one of the most powerful natural processes that we have out there, and something we get to see fairly regularly in this area in the Northwest. So thanks for coming. I'm going to try to make this entertaining, educational. If anyone has questions, please ask. I'm not an educator as much as a firefighter, so this is a little bit out of what I normally do, but happy to be here. You guys are probably all very familiar with the Bob Marshall Wilderness. It's one of the preeminent wilderness areas in the country, over 1.5 million acres, and it's shared by a number of different forests. The Flathead National Forest has the bulk of it, almost half, or actually over half, almost 1 million acres of it. The Bob Marshall, the Great Bear with the Hungry Horse Ranger District, the Lewis and Clark National Forest, the Rocky Mountain Ranger District has a really good portion. And then the Scapegoat Wilderness down with the Helena and the Lolo on the south end, with the Continental Divide and the Continental Divide Trail system running through it. Pretty amazing place, and a big piece of our landscape in this part of the world. As Carolyn said, I'm the Fire Management Officer at Spotted Bear, so this will be skewed a little bit towards the Flathead Forest and Spotted Bear because that's what I know best. But I'll also try to talk as much as I can intelligently do so about what's going on in Lewis and Clark and what has gone on in Lewis and Clark and the Helena and the Lolo on their portion of the wilderness areas. Got a lot of really cool photos. I can't say that I took them all myself. but I've got lots of friends that share photos, and then other friends that don't know they're sharing photos. So the bob is pretty, like I said, pretty amazing, and I just want to kind of start out with some photos of the bob. Obviously the Chinese Wall first, and we've got some of the high mountain lakes. We've got Holland Peak as you're looking up Big Salmon Creek. And of course, we've got the primitive use and the packers, which are a huge part of what happens in the Bob Marshall complex. Definitely not a photo that I took, but a very, very talented employee of ours. But we're here to talk about fire, and lightning is the main cause of the fires in the Bob. This is one of my favorite shots here. Our lookout that was up on Jumbo a number of years ago took this 2013 of the Damnation Fire under the stars. So pretty amazing. I'm going to try to put this away so I don't drop it. So tonight we're going to talk a little about the history of the Bob Marshall and the history of fire management of the Bob Marshall. We've come a long ways from where we started, and then we'll get into some photos and a little bit of video from and what happened this year, because we had a pretty substantial year in the Bob Marshall Wilderness and the Flathead Forest as far as fire went. The age-old question, is fire good or bad? And in this context, obviously fire is a bad thing. You know, anytime it's in people's backyards, it's burning houses, grazing lands, whatnot, we'll go ahead and say, yep, that's you put people in the equation, and fire's a tough thing. And it's something we have to be very vigilant about suppressing and controlling as much as we can. However, when you take people out of the equation, if you were to take people out of the equation, then it's really a natural function. And most of you guys are all really aware of that. In the Northwest, western part of the U.S., we're in a disturbance-based ecosystem. So fire is probably the main disturbance that we deal with. And it's pretty much the only one we try to really, I won't say that. It's one that we try very hard to control, at least outside of the wilderness. But it is a natural occurrence, and we could spend days and probably years discussing how that works, but we'll just kind of take that as an assumption. And it functions to create and maintain a mosaic of different vegetation on the landscape. There's a natural fire cycle, which starts from when there is fire, either natural or man-made fire, because prescribed fires become a very well-used tool. Then you get a lot of regrowth, revegetation that's really good for the wildlife, and the cycle continues into getting more trees. Finally, kind of the final stage, and this is very, very simplified, and I know there's a lot of people in this room that could speak a long time towards this cycle, but then you get some of the more mature stands of timber that aren't as good for, say, wildlife forage and that kind of thing, and they're very susceptible to fire. So fire is a natural process in the wilderness. Little more in fire ecology. This is Ponderosa pine stand. You can see it's nice and open and grassy underneath. Ponderosa pine is one of the species that's very adapted to fire and actually needs fire to survive. Fire comes through low severity or low intensity fire fairly frequently. Comes through. It keeps out all the brush and the new growth. Basically keeps the grass nice and healthy underneath. Not a lot of fuel. So a pretty low intensity fire. If you keep fire out of that ecosystem, then what happens is you get a lot of regeneration coming up of other conifer species. And you get a mixed conifer stand. When you're with that, you've got a lot more fuel and more intense fires. As that fully matures, you've got your ponderosa stands taken over by other species and high density forest with a lot of fuels. Okay, we'll try to not go too much further into the fire ecology. This is a nice picture of White River Park from 2013 down the Bob Marshall. You can see there's not a lot of fuel on the ground, very grassy, nice, beautiful open stand of ponderosa. Low intensity fire, able to keep the not getting into the trees, not getting into the canopies, only killing the understory. And we've got the high intensity fire. And with the high intensity fire, high severity fire, what you have occurring is totally a stand replacement fire event. And this is what it might look like afterwards. This is the Bear Creek fire from this year, one of the side drainages off the South Fork, where the fire burns very intensely. And it's stand replacement. It's not, it killed everything there pretty much. It's not going to be like that forever. It's basically starting that cycle over again. So it will come back, and it is a natural cycle. But for the time being, to our eye, it looks pretty ugly, and it's pretty hard to deal with if you are in the wilderness. This is a photo of the Lewis and Clark over Gates Park area. You can see what we're trying to get out there in the wilderness is more of a mosaic pattern. So you've got some high intensity fire in areas, then you've got places that it hasn't burned, and then you've got some other areas of lower intensity fire. And that's really what you're trying to get across the landscape is a mosaic pattern where you've got your ecosystems in different stages. So you've got some old growth, you've got some new growth, and it's more of a diverse ecosystem. A fire that would now come through here is going to have more breaks. There's going to be areas with less fuel and areas with more fuel. What I'm trying to show in this photo here, and this is the Fool Creek fire from 2003. Most of my photos I find have some kind of fire in them. What I was trying to show is this is a really even age stand of timber out here. This mostly lodgepole pine out here, very even age and very continuous. And this is the kind of area that once you get a fire developed in, and this is what happened during the Fool Creek fire in 2003, it tends to move through there in a stand replacement, with stand replacement fire. And so what we'd like to have, and this is an example here, this is the older fire scar. The Fool Creek fire burned all the way around this fire scar, but not through it. And what you want is to have more of these scars placed at different ages and different intervals through the forest. And that's what Mother Nature would normally do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and show some pictures of that in the future. So if you've gone through the Bob Marshall recently, and I imagine many of you have, you'll see that a large portion of it has burned recently. This is near Mud Lake on the South Fork, right along the East Side Trail. And this burned in 2003. And you can see on either side of the trail how many trees that have been cut out of that trail and how many trees have fallen across it. And how if you get off the trail, there's not really very far you can go. So for backcountry users, it's kind of a tough pill to swallow when you've got this kind of an environment. That's what happens when you've got a stand replacement fire comes through, and that's kind of the aftermath, the first entry fire. This is pretty close to the same area. This is looking off Mud Lake Lookout towards Big Salmon Lake. But you can see how much dead down fuel there is and timber, and how, getting off the trail and keeping the trail clear is a real challenge. So on the right side of this trail, what we have is unburned. We had it burned in 2003. All the trees that were standing fell down, and we've got a bunch of regen coming up. Still very thick and a lot of fuels there. On the left side is the Damnation fire from 2013. And you can see how that cleaned up a lot of that dead and down fuel. And it was a natural occurrence. And this is what Mother Nature is doing out there. As a wilderness user, you get something like this is going to come back with a lot of grass. You're going to get a lot more grasses in there, a lot more food for the elk and the deer, and it's going to be a lot more open and a lot more accessible to the backcountry user. And I'm not so much saying that because that's what we're intending and what we're trying to do. More or less saying it because I think there's been a lot of kind of negative feelings from people when we've got those first entry fires into the Bob Marshall Wilderness over the last 20, 30 years. And a lot of people see that, and they see the aftermath and all the dead trees and the down trees, and they kind of feel like it's a really negative thing, and it kind of doesn't do much for the recreation back there. Well, what we're doing now, with patience, we're getting those second and third entry fires, and we're going to get things back to more of a normal, natural landscape. Some more photos of this is Mud Lake Mountain, and you can see all the dead logs that are burning up in the fire. And it leaves a pretty clean, fairly clean afterwards. And that's, can be a very, very positive thing, and bring it back to more of a natural landscape back there. Okay, enough about fire ecology. The Bob Marshall Wilderness it had a lot of Native American use. And that's really, besides natural fire, that was the first introduction of, man-caused fire in the wilderness. I wouldn't say it was a huge part of it, but it was part of it. This is a map from 1899 that shows what was, at that time, the Lewis and Clark Forest and the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. Up to 1910, basically you had natural fire occurring quite a bit through the area. There's lightning strikes, fires would start, they'd burn unchecked on a natural part of the landscape. 1910 was a landmark year for the West. Over 3 million acres burned across the West, and depending on which history you or which account you get, up to a third of the Bob Marshall Wilderness area burnt during the 1910 fires. So a lot of fire occurring up until 1910 in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. And this is the best that they could do. They put together a map. Spotted bear would be here, Kalispell's up here in the wilderness area. This is what the fire history looked like from 1885 to 1929 in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. So you can see there's a lot of fire, and it's probably not even really indicative of how much fire there was, because they're using tree rings and other personal accounts to kind of get an idea of how much burned back then. But the 1910 fires were a landmark year for the Forest Service and for the West in general. The general feeling was that fire was bad, and we did everything we could, as we do in America, to put every fire out we possibly could. And we organized a lot of people and a lot of efforts into making that happen. We started a policy by which we called it the 10 a.m. policy, which every fire that started, we tried to have out by 10 a.m. the next morning. We put a whole lot of people to work inside and outside the wilderness area, stopping all fires. This is kind of a neat little part of it, at least in my mind, and kind of puts things in perspective for me. Some different lookout towers on the Flathead. C.J. Hash, who was one of the assistant supervisors, and who Hash Mountain was named after, Jumbo Lookout. Pretty extensive lookout system on the Flathead back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. At the height of the lookout system, there was 147 lookout towers or lookout sites that were staffed on the Flathead National Forest, which is pretty mind-blowing when you start thinking about how many people we have working on fire right now. They did a great job of identifying, locating the fires when they're small. They'd spot them. They'd call them in on their little phones. They had number 9 wire telephones run to every one of these points. Call them in, and then they'd grab their gear and they'd go off and put the fire out. And they did a great job of it. 1930s, early 1930s, we basically at the beginning of the Bob Marshall Wilderness and the Sun River Primitive Area, the Pentagon Primitive Area, and the South Fork Primitive Area. 1940 was when this was officially named the Bob Marshall Wilderness, after Bob Marshall, who most all of you know a little bit about, an amazing conservationist, one of the founders of the Wilderness Society, and a gentleman that spent a lot of times walking a lot of miles in the backcountry. Fire suppression continued through the 30s and 40s and 50s. We were really good at it. Smokey Bear came out. We got the message across. And our whole society was based on stopping fires. We used all sorts of equipment, from fixed-wing air tankers to helicopters to heavy equipment. We're using most all of that in the wilderness, not the heavy equipment, but we're still using the helicopters. We're still, even in the wilderness, putting out every fire that we possibly could. And so what happened is, this is the fire history from 85 to 29. And that's our fire history from 1930 to 1983. And it was something that people were very proud of. We thought as a society that we were doing a terrific job by putting, I shouldn't have done that, by putting out all those fires. And it's something everyone was really, really proud of, and you still read back to the accounts from the foresters back then. And you say, someone had a 10-acre fire, but it really wasn't their fault. They did really well. They did the best they could. Well, what that did, that era of fire suppression, was it gave the forest a chance to build up into what we have, these even-age stands of timber. We've gotten a lot more fuel out there. It's taken some of those ponderosa pine stands that used to be nice and open, and now they're filled up with Doug fir and lodgepole and other species, and much more prone to high severity fires. So we've got a changed landscape, or we had a changed landscape out there. In comes the Wilderness Act, 1964. Protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, which generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. Devoted to public purposes of recreation, scenic, scientific, educational, and conservation and historical use. It was pretty amazing. The Wilderness Act is something we celebrated a couple of years ago. The 50th anniversary, very impressive. Took a lot of work to get through, but it also said, in addition, such measures may be taken as may be necessary in the control of fire. Still, during the Wilderness Act, they're saying, we need to control fire. And when something needs to be stopped, we need to have that ability to do it. And so for a lot of time in the wilderness, we were suppressing every fire, still trying to suppress every fire, and we were using a lot of mechanized to do that. In the 60s, 70s, we started, the fire managers, land managers started really thinking, if it appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of human work substantially unnoticeable, then how can we put out every fire and still be doing that? We're going in there, we're putting in fire lines, we're putting retardant down, we're flying helicopters around, and we're stopping all these fires. It's really changing what the wilderness would naturally be. And they started talking, and they started making some changes. And in the 80s, they started allowing fire to burn in its natural. And I don't like to use the let burn term because it's got such a negative connotation these days, but allowing fire's natural role. It has a very large role on the landscape in the Northwest. But it's still fire, and it's still very dangerous and hard to control and not always very predictable. The first fire in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area is actually in the Scapegoat. First one they let go for natural was 1981 in the Scapegoat Wilderness, the Cigarette Creek Fire. But the first one that really had a lot of potential was the Charlotte Peak Fire, which is right off Big Salmon Lake, 1985. And it was pretty novel still back then. And we weren't, in the Bob Marshall, we were one of the first wilderness areas to be doing this, but not the first. And this photo and series is taken out of a National Geographic article that was written about it at the time, because it was a pretty huge thing, allowing fire its natural role and just staying back and monitoring and managing it. And it's a big step to be taken. And at a time when we had a lot of unburned fuels out there, we didn't have a mosaic on the land. These land managers, and some of them I even got to know, some of the fire managers, they were taking big risks. And they were kind of pioneering new age. Picture of Charlotte Peak and the fire. It didn't ever do a ton. You've got Big Salmon Lake in the background. It grew to 5,000 acres, but it was a success, and it was looked at as a success. And it was how we patterned and tried to pattern what at the time we're calling prescribed natural fire program. And the goal of wilderness fire management isn't so much to manage wilderness fire, but is to not manage wilderness fire. We'll try to allow fire as a natural process, manage the impacts of man-caused fire in the wilderness. So we'll put out or try to put out man-caused fires as long as we're not going to do more damage to the wilderness by doing that. Manage impacts of the fire in the wilderness on man. So we want to make sure that we keep people safe back there. And we don't want wilderness fires to get out of the wilderness. It's bad business. People get really skittish when you start allowing fires outside of the wilderness, and for good reason, because you start introducing fire into an environment where there's houses and people, then it's really hard to control, and understandably so. Our goal, permit lightning-caused fires to play as nearly as possible their natural ecological role within the wilderness. It doesn't give us the ability to do that for man-caused fires. We're still supposed to suppress all of them. The Canyon Creek Fire. So everything went well. 1985 was great. Didn't have much happening after that from 85 to 88. Then 1988, I've got to get to the right place in my notes. Apologize. 1988 was a really big fire year. Everyone heard of the Yellowstone fires in '88, where most of the Yellowstone National Park burnt, and it gave kind of the let burn policy a bad name. As fires went through a great portion of the Yellowstone National Park, we had our own little kind of prescribed natural fire disaster in '88, and this is started down on the Helena National Forest on the southern part in the Scapegoat Wilderness. The Canyon Creek Fire started in June. Early on, we're like, okay, well, the land managers and fire managers said, well, you know, it looks like it's in a good spot. It's a long ways from the edge of the wilderness. We'll go ahead and let that go. But the summer of 1988 wasn't like a lot of summers where you've got some rain at different times, or rain in the August singularity, as many people call it. So June turned into July, and July turned into August, and the fire kept on burning and burned up to 50,000 acres, and that was pretty big. Then making people pretty uncomfortable. But on September 6th, the jet stream surfaced. We got 40 to 70 mile an hour winds that pushed this fire outside of the wilderness. It burned 180,000 acres in 18 hours. And that's pretty impressive. Burned toward Augusta, burned up a lot of ranch land and threatened a lot of homes and ranches out there. It was really a tough situation for those folks out there. And what it made everyone realize is, hey, once you've agreed to let one of these fires go, whether it's June or July or August, you've bought it until the end of fire season. And some fire seasons are more extreme than others. Some are real quiet. Others like 1988, just kept on going and going until 5 days after this, they got a bunch of rain and it kind of ended it. But from 1988, because of the Canyon Creek fire, because of the Yellowstone fires, put another kind of damper on the wilderness fire program. But luckily, it didn't stop everything. People were able to kind of work through it, think through it, kind of relook at what we were doing and say, you know, we're really doing things right. We just have to be more careful. Once again, 85 to 29, 1930 to 1983, the suppression era. And it can't say it's maybe all suppression, maybe it's some climatological things, maybe a little cooler, but definitely didn't have any fire. This is what's occurred since 1984, and the majority of that's happened since 2000. We've had a lot of fire down there, a lot of fire on the landscape. This is the 1988 fire, Canyon Creek, up here at Gates Park. 2003, the Orange, lots of fire in 2003. 2007 with Fool Creek and Ahorn. And then some 2012 and 13 fires. But what we're starting to do is break this land up again. And so what we don't have is that continuous even age stands anymore. When I came into my position in 2007, I was in a pretty good spot. A lot of this had already occurred. I wasn't coming into a time where we were starting a fire, or we were going to allow a fire to burn here, and we weren't sure how far it was going to go, or it didn't really have any other fire scars to run into. The folks that came before had really, kind of done a lot of the heavy lifting, and now we've got a much better mosaic on the land, broken fuels. And that doesn't mean that during the dry fire seasons that things aren't going to continue to burn and burn actively and in an extreme way. But at least it gives us something to work with. And that's not all because of allowing fire its natural role. This is kind of This is across the West, the number of acres burned every year since 1915. You can see, like I said, this is the kind of the suppression era, where we're really, really effective at suppressing all fires. But we've had a dramatic increase in the number of acres burnt across the West. And this is not just wilderness areas. The number of acres we're burning is increasing dramatically. A lot of that has to do with fuels. A lot of that has to do with climate. Can't say it's just one thing. We're having now fairly unnaturally severe wildfires. As we talked about earlier, I mentioned it's not really representative of what a fully functioning ecosystem is because we've excluded fire for so long. But within the Bob, we're actually turning the corner. We're getting in there. We've got lots more fire on the ground, a lot more fire areas that have burned, and we've got a much larger mosaic out there. Any questions so far? Greg.
On the slide a couple of slides ago where they had the graph of the fires in the west, did that include that one right there? Is that counting the brush fires out in California and Texas, or is that strictly forest fires?
That's including everything in the west, yep. So, including everything in California. So lots of fires. Go ahead.
So you go through this history,
Mm-hmm.
and you're telling us how human beings are trying to be smarter than Mother Nature, which has existed forever and brought the planet to where it is just fine without us human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talk about how you're having to constantly rethink your strategies because of all these human errors that have occurred. What are you doing to study human psychology and figure out just who it is that should be making these monumental decisions on these fires?
Yeah, it's a big question, Bill. We're doing a lot of looking and talking, both at the higher levels and at the local levels. And you know where we are right now is that it's those local district rangers, land managers that really know the best, working with the fire management staff to kind of figure out where the best spot is to be. There's times when you're right, we want to let Mother Nature run her course as best we can, but there's a risk to that, and I couldn't pass the red face test if I said there wasn't. But each time we do that, we're lessening that risk in the long run. Because in the West, what we're seeing is 90%. Well, I'm not going to say, I won't give any percentage. A large part of the land base is going to burn at some point, and that's historic, and historically what's happened, and it's historically what we figure will happen. We can fight that, or we can do the best we can to work with it.
How do you decide which of the human beings are going to make these decisions?
Such a great question. We'll work into that. We'll talk a little about what goes into some of the decision making we do here. Any other questions before I move in? Go ahead.
Are you going to talk about beetle kill and how that might affect?
I had to cut a little bit out of this. I would love to, but not today. But it does have an impact. So, this 2015 fire season started out record-breaking drought. Extremely dry across the West, extremely dry in the Flathead Valley. This is spotted bear. Basically, this is a chart, and I won't explain too far into it, but basically talking about the drought and how much energy is in a piece of fuel to be burned. We're at record-breaking levels all the way through the early parts of July. Got little shots of rain, but we're definitely in a long-term drought. And like I said, I'm going to talk a little about spotted bear because that's what I know best. It was a huge fire season for us. 42 fires, which, well, it's not the most we've ever burnt. 19 of them we actually suppressed safely and successfully. 8 of them merged with other fires. 11 of those fires were over 100 acres. Some of that because we didn't get to them, and some of that because we allowed them to play their natural role. On the district, we burned 92,000 acres this year. That's almost 10% of the landscape. The Hungry Horse District had a couple of wilderness fires as well, burned 3,500 acres of the Great Bear. And the Rocky Mountain Ranger District also had a fairly big year, burned 67,000 acres on the Rocky Mountain front. That basically represents over half of the acres burnt in Montana this year. Mostly that percentage is so high because they didn't have a lot of fires in eastern Montana. But it's fairly telling on how much fire we put on the landscape. I'm going to go through a little bit, talk about our decision making and when we decide to allow a fire to burn or allow it to play its natural role. The Three Sisters fire, August 4th this year. We'd already had a busy fire season everywhere else, out in Idaho. Resources are pretty tied up. We got a lightning strike up here right near the Continental Divide. High elevation, great place for not a place that we'd had much fire. You can see right here, this is the Lewis and Clark Forest, and this is the Spotted Bear River drainage all the way over to Spotted Bear. We had typically fires move from the southwest to the northeast, or at least west to east in this area. And so we had these fire scars over here from Red Shale and from Gates Park for this fire to run into. So we felt pretty good about it. We did some looking. We said, well, how close is it to values at risk? And, we've got a couple cabins out there, but we can protect them pretty easily. We said, well, we're going to really impact a lot of public users. And a lot of people use this area right through here and come up on the Chinese Wall. But as far as life safety, probably not a lot of folks going to come through there. Another thing that factored into our decision was it was 5 acres when we first got to it. And thinking about getting enough people up to put out a 5-acre fire in the high elevation in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, it takes a lot of people, and it's going to take some time. It's going to take helicopters, more than likely, to be successful at it, possibly chainsaws. And so, we didn't want to necessarily put firefighters at risk out there for trying to stop what's a natural process. So by the end of the year, our 5-acre fire turned into about 487 acres. This is the Continental Divide. Burned a nice little portion of this area through here. We never put a single person on it. We had some people out, they posted some signs. We made sure that if we needed to do structure protection, some backcountry cabins, we could. But all in all, it's a fire that by doing nothing, we allowed fire its natural role, and it was a success, or at least in our mind, a success. August 12th. This is the beginning of our real fire season. Had a lightning storm come through the morning of August 12th. Almost every single one of those lightning and spotted bears sits, make sure I grab the right spot right in here. Lightning storm came in through August 12th, and these are the fires we got out of that. So got over 30 new starts in under 5 days. And so as a fire manager, as land managers, firefighters, we're trying to say, well, we've got the Three Sisters fire out here. Now we've got all these starts. We've got limited resources. We're trying to use as much as we can out in Idaho, doing what they can. So, what are we really looking at out here? Well, we're looking at, which one of these fires can do the most damage? What are the values at risk? And so right here is Spotted Bear, and we've got the Spotted Bear Ranger Station, and we've got the lodges and other infrastructure. We've got trailheads through here. Up here we've got some trailheads, the road system, and access into Schaefer Meadows. So we prioritized, and we looked at this set of fires here, which ended up being the Bear Creek Fire. And we said, pretty much unimpeded, they could get to Spotted Bear. They could create a block off the South Fork for the rest of summer. Those are going to be our priority. These fires up here, deep in the wilderness, lots of natural barriers up here, not too worried about them. These two right here, right near Schaefer Meadows, lots of continuous fuels. We ended up putting smoke jumpers in on one of those and putting out the other one with firefighters. And this bunch of these fires through here were already getting active. And we said, they're going to burn into the wilderness, and we're going to prioritize them a lot lower. So these are our values at risk in the wilderness. Basically people and facilities, administrative facilities, but then just the wilderness itself. The wilderness nature and the wilderness ethic that we're trying to preserve. And we're trying to preserve that by not getting in there and trying to suppress all the fires, not putting smoke jumpers in there when we don't have to, not making that scar on the land. If we can get to fires when they're smaller, like this fire here, 2 or 3 people can deal with them. So in our decision time frame, if we're going to put a fire out, we need to do it, and we need to make that decision and do it quickly. I'm going to kind of back on time a little bit. Mechanized use in the wilderness. Something we try not to do as much as possible. But there are times when it makes sense, when it's a balance. We can send a couple 3-4 smoke jumpers into a fire that's a 1/4 acre if we have to put it out, versus waiting for people to hike into it, which may take 2 or 3 days, or maybe a day, 2 days. Then it's going to take a lot more people to put it out. And so we're balancing the level of intrusion that we're going to be putting in. So of these fires, this is outside the wilderness here, inside the wilderness. Successfully able to put a couple of these out. Turned out that the Trail Creek fire right in this area escaped our initial attack, and then also the Bear Creek fire. Trail Creek by the second day was about 20 acres. Bear Creek was up to 50 acres. And this is the Trail Creek fire taking off, burning up the Trail Creek drainage on August 13th. We made the decision not to place anybody on the upper end of this fire, on the fires in its path, because of this potential. So, August 20th turned out to be a pretty big day for those of us at Spotted Bear. This is what the Bear Creek fire, this is the perimeter right here, this kind of clear space from August 20th, the morning of August 20th. We were concerned, and Spotted Bear sits right up in here. We were concerned about what Bear Creek might do. We had fire behavior analysts run a bunch of a bunch of different models for us, and we were nervous, but the information we were getting was that in 21 days, this is kind of the largest extent that they could see it moving. Well, those models, and I'm not blaming them, models are useful, but they're all wrong. What it actually ended up doing that day, everything kind of aligned. This is the Bunker Creek drainage. The humidities got down low. We started getting a pretty good west wind. Fire got established in the bottom down here and moved all the way down the Bunker Creek drainage. Burned from under 1,000 acres to over 17,000 acres by the end of the day. And burned past the Gorge Creek trailhead, the Meadow Creek trailhead. From here to here is a little over 9.5 miles. And it made that move in about 4.5 hours. Nothing like the move the Canyon Creek fire made in 1988, but under the conditions that we had and what we thought might be happening, it was a big move. And of course, it had us scrambling and trying to get people and horses out of the way. Now, if you bear with me for a second, I'm going to play a video. So this is the afternoon of the 20th, around 1700, 5 o'clock, just about. Just above the Gorge Creek trailhead, one of our helicopters flying in to take a look. You can tell one of the things you can see is the continuous fuel. Lodgepole pine, fairly even stand. And we've got the Gorge Creek trailhead where we have one of our outfitters set up. At this point, we have him evacuated. He's moved out. Still has a lot of his equipment in here, a couple of vehicles. And this was 5 miles from the fire that morning. And it moved pretty much 2 to 3 hours, moved that far. So kind of caught us. What I'd like to point out here, though, is the fuels reduction work that was done at this trailhead. There's a vehicle parked right here that survived, and then some of these tents and one of these vehicles did not survive, but others of them did survive. And with the fire moving with that intensity, that's a pretty impressive thing to happen. This was pretty much a full flaming front from one side of this drainage to the other. And so the Gorge Creek trailhead, once again, was right in here. Meadow Creek trailhead right there. The next day, we couldn't see much because of the smoke laid in real thick. We weren't even really sure where the fire was. The 2-Bear helicopter came up. We worked with the county, and they were able to get some of these infrared images for us. This is the South Fork River. It's kind of an interesting image. They were able to actually map the fire for us. The Bunker Creek drainage. full stand replacement fire as it came through there. Both sides of the road, both sides of the drainage. One of the bridges up Bunker Creek, we'd done some protection on. Was not successful. Gorge Creek Trailhead. Once again, we'd done a bunch of work in here, and this is one of the successes from what we found. These vehicles burned, but within this trailhead, and I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, because at the time I was concentrating on other things.
Is that Meadow Creek?
This is Gorge Creek, this one. So at this, 2 camper trailers and 2 other vehicles survived that were at this trailhead, all due to the fact that we had done that fuels treatment. Now we're going to move down to the Meadow Creek Trailhead, which is down here. This is the Packers Roost. A lot of the outfitters lost quite a bit. I'd say one of the vehicles, we've got a hay trailer. A lot of them were getting ready to put a bunch of hay in the backcountry for hunting season. Lots of hay on trailers, which is really hard to keep from burning up. Hay sitting on trailers. But if you look in the background, what you're seeing is some green trees and vehicles that did make it. And there was a fuels reduction project that went around that they did in the trailhead, this trailhead as well. And you can see that it took that stand replacing crown fire, and it basically either went around this at certain points or it dropped it to the ground, which is pretty impressive when everything around this is complete stand replacement. This is the Meadow Creek Trailhead here. And you can see how these trees had been thinned out, how there's green grass in there. There were 16 vehicles at this trailhead, and all of them survived. The Meadow Creek Bridge. And also, like I said, you can see the green trees and what did survive. One of the stories that were probably the more significant ones from the summer and that we remember the best, or at least I do, was there was over 70 head of stock at this trailhead at the Packers Roost where this fire was coming through. The outfitters that were around that weren't in the backcountry and a bunch of Forest Service employees pretty much drove anything up we could put stock in and moved 70 head of stock in about an hour. And not all of them made it into a vehicle. Some of them had to run down the road. But it was a really good example, I think, and something I remember of how well everyone was working together in a very tense time, and what the outfitters were able to do. They lost a lot. The outfitters back there lost a lot of equipment, lost vehicles, lost hay, and because so many other things went well, I don't want to minimize that by any means. What amazes me is the great attitude they all had towards it. They weren't happy, understandably, but they were resilient and understanding. So the season, any I guess good time to stop for questions. Was a very big day for us when you get a fire go from under 1,000 acres to over 17,000 acres in the afternoon. And that's just one of the fires we had going at the time. The Trail Creek fire on the other side of Spotted Bear, I think it went from about 4,000 acres to 12,000 acres, burning up into the wilderness. We had other fires in the wilderness that also got larger. We kind of moved to this is the Spotted Bear Ranger Station. This is where the fire ended up, just across the river from us. This is the Bear Creek Fire. Moved to kind of a point protection strategy, to where we didn't have the resources to go out and stop the fire. And in a lot of ways, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense, would have put a lot of people in danger. What we did have the resources to do is to do point protection around the values at risk, the cabins, the lodges, and that's what we put a lot of our effort into. One of the historic stories that I read was from 1929, when they had a fire up Sullivan Creek, which is just north of Spotted Bear, and they had over 600 firefighters on it. Something less than less than 10,000 acres, I think. Over 600 firefighters was a big deal. On this fire, I think at the height we had 150 firefighters, and more than not, we were more around 80 to 90 firefighters because of everything else happening across the country. On the 20th, as the fire made that big move and cut off, ran through the Meadow Creek trailhead, jumped the South Fork of the Flathead River, then it continued going south. We had to do a lot of work to get backcountry users out of the wilderness. All those 16 cars belonged to groups of people that planned to use them. This was a pack rafting group that had been pack rafting for 7 to 8 days in the wilderness. They were about to get to Meadow Creek when the fire cut them off. We had inserted some people. Some of our firefighters went back, made contact with them, got them turned around. It ended up being another 35 mile hike for them to get out. They're at the end of their trip. They were not excited about it. We couldn't really tell them whether their vehicles made it or not at the time. So we had an outfitter, and this is the Bear Creek Fire here. We had an outfitter up the White River with a bunch of stock and two people that he was guiding in the backcountry. As the Bear Creek Fire was taking off, going to 17,000 acres, the Shell Creek Fire was moving. Fires over here on the Lewis and Clark burning. He had 2 fires in the White River that he saw. This is a guy that's fairly used to being in the backcountry, fairly knowledgeable. He decided his life was in danger and the lives of his customers. And he called the sheriff's office and was evacuated by helicopter. Let his stock go free, and came in and got him later. It was a lot of fire in the backcountry at that time. We ended up closing down the entire Spotted Bear Ranger District for the entire wilderness portion of the Spotted Bear Ranger District, and large portions of the other districts and the Lewis and Clark were closed as well. At one point, almost every trailhead in the Bob Marshall was closed due to fire this summer. So backcountry users, we'd try to get them information as best we could, but they'd be in the middle of a trip and we wouldn't know where to send them because new fires were breaking out on a daily basis. And it caused a lot of heartache for people, a lot of extra travel. And that's when we had to basically we decided to shut our district down. It wasn't safe. We couldn't provide for the people, backcountry users' safety.